The ranking member is now recognized for an opening statement.
And thank you kindly, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our sheriffs and other law enforcement who've joined us here today. The gentleman from California rushed to give President Trump credit for dramatic decreases in violent crime that have been taking place over the last several years, long before he ever got to office. Beginning in 2022, under President Biden, the country experienced a major reduction in homicide and violent crime. That trend continued in 2023, 2024. By 2024, nationwide murders had dropped by 26% since the peak in 2020, with 2024 having the largest one-year drop in murders ever recorded in American history. On the day that Trump was inaugurated, crime had fallen to 60-year lows. So it's true that the downward trend has continued despite the fact that the Trump administration, as everybody on this committee knows, cut hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to state and local law enforcement and victims organizations as soon as they got into office. That was the first thing that we were fighting about in this committee when Doge and Elon Musk cut hundreds of millions of dollars in grants that had already been slated for our communities and for our state governments. But look, let's get to the question of the bill before us today. Now, we often say in our committee that to believe in the Constitution is to respect it and defend it, even if it gets in the way of your momentary political passions or your party conference's policy agenda. So who will stand up for the 10th Amendment? The right of the people in our state and local governments not to be conscripted and coerced into service and commandeered by the federal government to implement federal policies chosen at a different level of government. You might love what ICE has been doing in Minneapolis. You might hate it. You might love the idea of sanctuary cities, or you might hate it. But regardless, this bill goes way beyond sanctuary cities. This bill is a full-blown assault on the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. It's an attempt to force every state and local government in America to turn every sheriff, police officer, and other public employee, not just for the question of detainers and sanctuary, which is what our friends keep talking about, but for every other aspect of immigration law, into an agent of the federal government and of this administration's basically incompetent and dangerous immigration operations. It's not enough for our colleagues that DHS now has more than 80,000 police officers of its own, more than the number of officers in New York, Chicago, LA, Houston, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Las Vegas, and Dallas combined, or that it is a larger annual budget than 150 nations on earth. They now also want to force every local state and police officer in America essentially to be deputized federal law enforcement agents with respect to immigration, to participate in their operations and to follow their policy orders. Now, fortunately, we don't have to argue this from the beginning because there's a Supreme Court decision right on point from 1997, Prince versus United States, which I'm sure our friends in law enforcement know well, where Justice Scalia decided for the court that the federal government may not compel state and local governments and state and local officials to enforce and implement federal laws. The decision struck down the provision of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act that required local law enforcement, like sheriffs and police chiefs, to cooperate with the ATF and the FBI to conduct violent criminal, fugitive, and illegal alien background checks on all handgun purchasers in America. The purpose of the legislation was, of course, to prevent the violence and the bloodshed of innocent Americans caused by hundreds of thousands or millions of unqualified applicants obtaining a firearm. So there was a very clear public safety rationale. But the Supreme Court held that despite the fact that it actually would improve public safety and reduce violence, congressional commandeering of state and local officials, state and local governments, and state and local taxpayer resources violates the 10th Amendment principles of federalism and dual sovereignty, the separate political sovereignty of the states and local governments. The Constitution simply does not grant Congress the power to force state executives to administer federal programs, even for a paramount or excellent public safety purpose, like saving lives of the people, as the Brady background check indisputably did, and as the Supreme Court accepted for the sake of arguments, but they said it violated the Constitution. It was Sheriffs Jay Prince of Montana and Richard Mack of Arizona who challenged the federal requirement, arguing that it unconstitutionally compelled them as local law enforcement officials to implement federal laws. The court found that coercing state officials and local officials to enforce federal laws violates the sovereignty and the integrity of state and local governments under the 10th Amendment, blurring the critical lines of political accountability in the American federalist system and conscripting state and local taxpayers to subsidize federal priorities with their limited local tax dollars and revenue. So the bill before us today would do the exact same thing. It would prohibit states from having any laws or policies that set any limits on how much time and resources state and local officers would spend on federal immigration law enforcement. What could be a greater assault on state and local government than saying that these local officials can be conscripted and then supervised by the federal government, which is going to immunize them now for any lawsuits that might ensue, to do the bidding of the federal government. So they also throw in another cardinal unconstitutional feature, a Godfather offer, what the Supreme Court has called an unconstitutional condition, here an effort to condition a community or a state's receipt of federal funding on the surrender of a 10th Amendment power. In another decision, National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius, the court noted that the 10th Amendment's prohibition holds true whether Congress directly commands a state to regulate or indirectly coerces a state to adopt a federal regulatory system as its own. This bill would defund state and local police departments simply because they dare to require that all of their employees' time be used to be working on state and local laws rather than federal laws. So, my friends, again, let's not confuse the policy question from the constitutional question. I would hope that everybody here on the committee who believes in the 10th Amendment, as well as the Second Amendment implicated in the Prince case, would stand up for these constitutional principles. And I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back without objection. All other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California.